Okay, we're introducing ourselves. So I'll begin by introducing myself. I'll keep it brief and then pass to the panelists. My name is Darren Chetty. I am a lecturer at UCL. I was a primary school teacher. I wrote an essay or an online piece for Media Diversified called "You Can't Say That, Stories Have to Do About White People," which then became a chapter in The Good Immigrant, edited by Eishar, and which now is used at some teaching in colleges and is used in schools, which I'm really pleased about, and also led to me writing with Karen Sands O'Connor Beyond the Secret Garden, which is a column which I hope you've heard of.
Yes.
Thank you. Which is for Books for Keeps, which is a free online periodical, comes out every 2 months. And we try and map sort of themes and look at the representation of racially minoritized children in mostly British children's literature. And typically that means starting with some pretty horrific historical books and moving towards some very exciting contemporary books. And it's more of the latter that we'll be talking about on this panel. So passing on.
Hello, I'm Cherish Lopes-Baker. I lead the children's publishing for Tate Museum Publishing. I was brought on board a couple of years ago to completely re-envision the list and make it more inclusive and accessible.
Hi, my name's Eishar Brar. I'm editorial director at Knights Of. We're a children's publisher, an indie children's publisher focused on publishing underrepresented voices. So my role is to commission authors and to prove that books from authors like many in this room are commercially successful and don't have to be traumatic, and I focus on joyful, non-trauma-led narratives.
Hi, I'm Jake Hope. I'm a librarian by profession, although I'm a librarian without a library. So I now look after the Carnegie Medals, which are the UK's oldest children's book awards. And in addition to that, I'm publisher liaison for Inclusive Books for Children. I teach editorial on the UCLan Publishing MA and do a variety of other things. But yeah, really nice to be here.
Okay, so as you can see, we've got some heavy hitters on the panel, so it's going to be really interesting to hear what they have to say. Let's start with what I hope is an easy one, which is around what we'll call a South Asian book, and I want to unpack that a little bit later. A book that you've enjoyed recently, and perhaps you can say a little bit about why you enjoyed it as well.
I think, well, my favorite picture book, South Asian picture book, has to be Like the Moon Loves the Sky. I just feel like I'm being hugged by the illustrations. But my favorite like general book recently, I have to plug Icarus by Kate Ingram. Honestly, one of the best books you'll read this year. Just a queer heist story that so good.
Brilliant choices. I'm going to plug one of my own books from Knights Of, because why not? We just published Here to Slay by Radhika Sanghani. It's a YA take on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but rooted in Hindu mythology. And it has like sapphic romance, brown girls kicking demons. It's incredible. And then from my own reading experience, like in my life, when I was a teenager, I read Rani and Sook by Bali Rai. Don't know if anyone remembers that book. It was like a Punjabi retelling of Romeo and Juliet, and it was so brilliant and relatable. And I think that was the first time I read brown kids in kids' books. I was just reading like not that before that. So yeah, those are my two. Oh, you've got mine.
Thank you. Yeah, you say this is a really easy question. Actually, for a librarian, it's a very difficult one.
You can say more than one.
I think in The Shadow of the Wolf Queen, Karen Millwood Hargrave, I think this is a fantastic book. Personally, it meant a lot to me coming from the north, being based in the Lake District. Really nice to see a genre-led fantasy book, really immersive, and I think it's going to be a trilogy as well, which is very exciting.
Okay, so thank you for those. I haven't read all of those. So by the way, if anyone wants to send me books to write about the book picking, please talk to your publishers. I'm not talking about you personally doing it. The reason I say that is because we tend to run, or I run the column at a loss, as in I spend more money than I get paid to write it. But that's by the by. The more books you can send, the better. And some publishers do that, and some don't. South Asian as a category. So presumably those of us in the room many of us are comfortable with that category. I remember from my primary school days as a teacher that children rarely sort of identified it as South Asian. So I'm wondering about how useful that is as a category in your thoughts, useful in terms of audience, useful in terms of whether writers identify as South Asian. We often see people use other descriptors, whether it's about a country or a religion, or sort of broader umbrella terms that are more politicized, like people of color. What are your thoughts on the category of South Asian, and also that, you know, we're in Britain, so are we talking about British South Asian in particular? Anyone like to kick us off on that?
So I think that for me, in my career and in my life, South Asian is useful as an umbrella term for statistics. So like the incredible work that CLP have done, I think Farah's here, where they gather the statistics of what representation looks like, especially in kids' books, and they have a reflecting realities report that comes out every year. And that's useful because just to gather the numbers. And then when you drill down into it, it's like 0.3%, and you're like, in all of like the nuances of what South Asian is, it's shocking. But then going into that, I don't know anyone who uses that term to describe themselves. And obviously everyone here knows that there's so much nuance, it's not a monolith. So it's not that useful from a publishing term. Like if I get sent a submission or an author's talking to me and the term South Asian is used, you can't really pick up much from there, and you can't really gauge much about a story or someone's background. And I also think that maybe we lean on it a bit much because of the need for community, which is really important. You want to feel that amongst all these different people from different backgrounds, we have something in common, which we do, but it is maybe not politically so useful, or in publishing so useful to really drill down into what's needed. Go on.
I think I would agree. I think it's really useful. For example, it's brought us all here today together, the South Asian Illustration and Literature Fest. I think I'm part of quite a few community groups like South Asians for Palestine. I think it's a really good way for us to come together. I think publishing in general might use it sometimes to not bother learning about the different communities. Controversial take.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Coming up in publishing, I think the current push for diversity, which we've seen, has been in the last few years, really, I think, spurred on by CLP. Again, thank you, Farah. The report, which I think the first one was like 2018. And I think coming up in it was very, very white. And I think the people that I interacted with used it very comfortably as a blanket term without bothering to get to know about like Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Kashmiri, like Goan, which I am. Like, it was just a very catch-all. So I think it can be useful. I think it can be harmful. It depends in whose hands, I guess. I think we're obviously not a monolith. It's helpful to know where each of us is coming from individually in terms of like region, religion, all these things that are our differences, but also our strengths. And it's great to know that about each other. It's also great, I think, to drill down even more into like, I think what I find lacking is like disability rep and queer rep. Like, I feel like South Asian representation, I find publishers kind of skating by on just surface level, and I would love to see a wider breadth, I think.
Yeah, I think community is incredibly important, and I think on a personal level, that's something that probably affects all of us, and in those terms, I think it's very helpful. I think the other way it's helpful is in terms of critical mass. So it allows us to unify and to lobby for change. And I think there are changes that are definitely needed, and coming together is a way of being able to achieve that. I think where the danger with umbrella terms lies, and the broader the umbrella term is, the bigger the danger, is that unfortunately it then becomes very easy to pay lip service and to be tokenistic. I have worked with a number of organisations who have quotas for diversity, but actually the quotas that they're looking at, they will tend to just meet that by having the first person of colour that comes to mind, and then that's done, job done. And I think that becomes very problematic, and it doesn't allow the kind of granular detail that probably we need to be looking at to achieve meaningful change.
Okay, thank you. So when I started teaching, which was last century, I taught my final teaching practice. I taught in a school in Birmingham. There were 60 children in the class, and 57 of those were from a South Asian background. In the book corner, there was a single book authored by a South Asian author. That's 1996-7. That was Arvind Kumar's Heartstone Odyssey. Now at this point, Fruit Dondi was publishing, Jamila Gavin were publishing, and you know, I just couldn't find those books, but I've since learnt about it. Things have changed since then. What's the current state of things in terms of what you're seeing being sent, what you're seeing being published, and where are the sort of gaps? Where are the things that you think? I mean, you've already sort of said a bit about this, Cherish, but what still needs to be done? So it's a kind of, let's acknowledge that we've had some progress, but let's not get complacent. Who'd like to take that one up?
Yeah, again, happy to. So I think you made a brilliant point already, Cherish, about the intersections being really lacking. I think that publishing sort of hit on what was maybe thought to be a sweet spot 5, 6, 7 years ago, which was like retellings, myths and legends. And I think that in terms of what comes from South Asian creators, that was considered to be successful. And so is what publishers were like, okay, more of that, because that ticks that box. Like you said about quotas, Jake, once something comes along that works, then the industry tends to jump on it. And so I find when I'm looking for books that I'm really looking for contemporary, I'm looking for the nuance of experience that comes like not just from the heritage that people are, but what their lived experience is, like disabled voices, neurodiverse voices, queer voices. And those are really kept at the bottom of the pile. And it's harder for those authors, I think, to break through, because what's considered the metric of success is myths and legends. And actually maybe also still quite colonial perspectives, I think, which as a community we do have to reckon with. Living, like you said, British South Asian, British Asians are still terms that are used, and in children's books that does come across quite strongly from South Asian authors, especially ones that have done well in like the past couple of decades. I think they're more palatable to white gatekeepers, so they cut through quicker, they're bought in by publishers, they're considered the metric of success. And now there is a gap, there's a big gap where we could have genre stories, we could have crime, we could have horror, we could have for kids more sci-fi, less mythical fantasy, but there's so much to do, I think. Would you like to talk more?
Sure. I guess I always imagine, when I think about this question, I always imagine like a really big library, like an unending library, and you can see all the books that have been published, and they're all white, and it goes on for decades, centuries even, until now. And so when I think about the stories that we get to tell, I'm like, tell them all. There's so much space that there's so many stories left for us to tell that I feel like it could be any story. And that's generally my ethos when I talk to authors. Like if I really like an author's work, I'm just like, what story do you want to tell? Rather than me asking for one and trying to chase trends in the publishing market, which we all know is, tends to just stay on a trend until it dies. I do think that mythology, I think it served us at one point. I do still think it's good, because growing up, we just had compendiums of like South Asian stories by white authors. And like, I think there's still space for us to have our own retellings. There's so many that haven't been told, again, because we just keep getting the same ones retold again and again. But I think there's space for more contemporary stories. I'd love to see like comedies. I saw a really great like Sri Lankan parkour young adult. Like there's so many stories out there that I want to see them all published. I think that I think the trend right now, I've seen a lot of ones about race, like just directly talking about it, following like 2020 and everything. I think there is use for those. I don't want to say we shouldn't be publishing those anymore, but I think publishing has a hard time conceptualizing like we should be publishing more. Here's the greater breadth of stories we can be telling. And like, I think authors themselves are the best ones to tell us, because it's their stories. It's, the stories are coming from their heart. It's their inspiration. I find that, yeah, I want to be led by supporting my authors and illustrators and everything like that.
Yeah, I think there are a great many stories to be told. And I think one of the problems that we potentially have goes back to the point that Parminder was making at the beginning about gatekeepers. I don't know whether anyone, this is a very odd analogy and I do apologise in advance, I don't know whether anyone has seen those peculiar devices where you put a boiled egg inside it and you crush it and it basically becomes a square boiled egg. And it feels a little to me like, because the apparatus and the profile of booksellers, of publishing, of libraries, of schools is so much geared towards education and the idea of windows rather than mirrors, that I think we're constantly having our stories shaped for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like we're not saying, myths, legends, historical stories are a bad thing, but that there is a sense that publishers may favour them, and that that might fall into a longer tradition of wanting the sort of the exotic East. And I think writers are actually subverting that often when they do that work. But contemporary grandkids in London, I don't see a lot of. I know London isn't the world, but I don't see many of those books, or as many of those books still. Am I just missing them, or would you agree with that?
I'm sorry. I think there are authors that are doing that, but they just are so few and far between. And I think also that when we're sitting here and saying that we want to see these things, it's also useful to remember, not in a really negative way, but we obviously want to see them. And there are so many people who actually don't really care that much. So our job is to persuade them, in the industry, is our job to persuade them that there are readers who want to see that. And to meet that, but we're also having to do this twofold thing of, obviously we know that matters, obviously we want to do that, obviously we want to see all the stories published, but then there comes in this question of what's commercially successful, what can work in the market. And that is part of our jobs, to turn on that side of our brain, which is people just care about numbers. They don't care about, well, that sounds harsh because loads of people in publishing care about stories and all stories are important, but the way to get through those meetings is to say, this is going to make money. Here are all the readers that are going to read that. And I think that's also an important conversation that needs to be had. It's a bit gauche, like no one really wants to talk about money, but it is important to say that it's a huge population. Those stories and those kids that need to see themselves reflected in books, that is where the term South Asian comes in useful, because it both bolsters our numbers. If you dig down into the nuance when you're having those conversations, someone's going to be like, but that's like 0.03% of the population. When if you say South Asian, it pushes it up a bit. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. But
well, I think it adds some useful context. Does anyone else want to say more about that? Or, in fact, Jake, I'll push you, if I may, given your Carnegie role. So are you seeing in the books that are nominated, are you seeing South Asian authors and South Asian characters, acknowledging that those aren't necessarily one and the same?
I think to a certain extent we are, but I would also say that the processes involved with the Carnegies, essentially for a book to be nominated for the Carnegie, it's not a case of publishers submitting, a librarian has to put it forward. And each librarian only has one nomination per category, illustration and writing. So we do see the books coming forward, but because of the limited demographic profile of librarianship, which is very, very limited, you're talking about probably about 92% white, mainly female, mainly over a certain age. So I think because of that, there are still barriers and blockades that are actually quite difficult to remove. But I think there are books coming through, there is more being published, but I don't think there's as much breadth as there could be.
Yeah, I mean, Karen and I were part of the diversity review that you initiated at Carnegie. And we looked at the criteria. I attended a judges meeting to see how that happened, and I was struck by who was and who wasn't in the room. And as you said, that idea that you nominate just one book, so it's not like I found a bunch of interesting books and some of them might not have had as much attention. All those things seem to add to it. Now, since that review, and I'm not by no means claiming a causal effect, but I think 3 writers of colour have won the Carnegie at the time none had in its history. But we're yet to see a South Asian, a winner from South Asian background. Is that right?
That's entirely right. And to be honest, the changes that we've seen happened and the winners that we've seen happen have kind of happened in the way that I projected that it would happen. So first of all, the books that won by people of colour were from the US. That didn't come as any particular surprise. And then we had our first sort of Black British winner this year. And again, I kind of anticipated that would be the case. I hope this change will continue. But again, as she won the Shadowist choice, which is decided by the young people. So there's a slightly different situation at play, I think. It's much easier to get a wider demographic profile with that.
And one of the things I seem to spend an awful lot, and I've never courted this, but I've been a judge of a lot of book awards. I'm typically one of the only people of colour in the room, and almost definitely the only man of colour in the room. And one of the things I do, I think, is I think why I'm invited is to sort of sometimes advocate for the consideration of books that might have been glossed over. So it's not a 12 Angry Men situation. Exactly. But there's certainly, I noticed from the inside that this sort of taste-making stuff, you need people, and I'm in a very privileged position that I can just about afford to do this work, and that takes a certain class privilege as well. So who gets to decide which books get the shine in terms of the very limited mainstream press that we have for children's literature, which is completely disproportionate to how much money it generates, is another question. I want to move to something else that is perhaps not limited to South Asian writers, but I want to see what your thinking is, which is that my sense is, both as a writer and talking to others, is that there's often a pressure to provide characters that are sort of role models. I know there have been, I'd probably rather not discuss the actual books, but I know there's been controversies where characters of colour have written characters, sometimes parent figures, based on their own experiences, where those parents aren't, ideal parents by a long shot, and people have been worried about what this will mean for the community, given the issues of representation. Is that an issue? Are you seeing that in writing, that we're trying to promote sort of, good South Asian people, and how that? I guess my concern is that can be a really good quick fix, but it can impact how we write good literature, which is typically about characters who are flawed and aren't, fully rounded, and people we aspire to be so much. Who wants to take that one?
So at Tate, I mostly do picture books, but we are expanding to middle grade, young adult, and graphic novels. Picture books, it's very simple. Kids are kids, they're tantrums, they're gonna do all this stuff, but I think it mirrors young adult and other books as well, because to have a story, you need to have conflict, you need to kind of have a flawed character, a character who's making decisions. And I guess we are a little biased because we are South Asian and we are working towards inclusive literature. Like, I don't think we're trying to stop that. Like, I think we have enough of a nuanced perspective to encourage that. I can imagine it could be an issue with other publishers. I think that's also why I love, though, that CLPE looks at not just the quantity, but the quality. I think that's really important. I think in this current push for diversity, and it's such a strong push, I think it's come such a long way. But in the great scheme of things, still at the beginning, it's really important that we keep ourselves to that standard of quality and making sure that we're publishing nuanced, like holistic perspectives, and not just trying to, I mean, like The Good Immigrant, like not trying to portray this model South Asian character, but like fun characters who are figuring themselves out. I feel like that is the crux, I think, in a lot of children's books, is figuring themselves out. So I would hate it if that got lost in the mix.
Yeah, I think I'll add that. Obviously, completely agree that we should be focusing on the widest variety of narratives. I do think that something you said there, Darren, about pressure from within our own community is quite real. That is something that I've seen happen in certain forms, where when you are pushing the boundary of what these characters are doing, especially in middle grade and YA, which is what I work across, publishing, for example, a queer South Asian book has received, I've received a couple of emails, and it's not that I don't expect that. And I think that is something that you have to take into account in any community. There's always, bias and prejudice. But I also think that there is this idea that the books, an old school idea, but it's true, there's an idea that the books that kids are reading, especially South Asian kids, should be exemplary. And the kids should be exemplary, and they should be setting an example, and how they end up in the book should be like just the best of the best. And that is also a way that a lot of people in South Asian communities have grown up reading, is that even reading is to further yourself, is to gain knowledge, is to get you on a path to success. These are stereotypes, but they're also rooted in truth. And I think that they can lead to some stereotypical narratives where the characters are doing those things, or the stories that are pushed to the front are showing that. So there is a bit of work to be done, I think, also within communities to push away from that. And I think it is being done. Like, the breadth of books that's being published is wider, boundaries are being pushed. Authors don't want to write the same story again and again. I don't know any author who wants to do that. So it's not that that's coming from the creatives, but I do think that there's like a twofold thing of what has been traditionally presented as a perfect South Asian ideal or a story is what publishing saw for so long. So they think that's what it is. And it's like this cycle that we're trying to break. But I wonder from librarians if there's anything different.
I think, yeah, there probably is. And I think this probably goes wider than librarians too. I think some of it is to do with burden of responsibility. And I think because sort of representation of people by colour generally has been so poor, because it has tended to be very negative historically in children's books. They have been the villains. There has been a feeling that if a child is going to encounter a book with a sort of South Asian character, that actually you want that experience, that limited experience, to be a positive one. Yeah. And so I think there is that sort of internal weight of responsibility too.
Yeah, and we're speaking then to the sort of broader political climate that, my question wasn't sort of to criticize those writers who are doing that, but to say, this is a situation you find yourself in where you're like, here's my chance to have a South Asian character that kids might relate to. I need to make sure this is a good person, but then how is that going to impact on writing as well? And you've mentioned also some I know, potentially controversial areas around where the community are concerned about certain things being discussed. Have you had experience of that, Teresa, or picture books? You've made picture books actually very simple, and as I've got one out, I'd like to argue they're very complicated. But have you had experience of that?
I mean, they're not simple by any means, but I do think 3 to 5 year olds aren't held to the same standard of behavior. I would really hope. But no, I totally understand what it means to have that pressure from the community to be upstanding and to be all these things. I would say that I read a really interesting article dissecting the villains that we grew up with, and actually how, looking back on them now, how queer-coded they were, and people of color and all this stuff. And when you look back on them, they were making some solid points. They were making some like anti-colonial points, things like that, like Killmonger, like things like this. Like, I think there's, not to say killing everyone is a good thing, but I think that all of these things are down to how the creator brings you on that journey. I think having black and white is usually not great in a book. If you're going to have this perfect pedestal of a person, they're never going to have internal conflict. If you have like a really bad villain, like that's going to plant really harmful stereotypes. But I think having that nuance and the journey that the author brings you on is the important part. But again, like I'm biased, I'm already looking for that. I think, yeah, it's down to the creator and the editor, the person who's helping them create, to make sure that we're doing justice to these narratives.
And you mentioned editor there, and my experience has been in publishing, in terms of who's editing the work and who's doing the publicity and the marketing. They're typically not themselves people of colour. We have two publishers here, but is that a broader issue, and how can that be addressed?
Yeah, it's absolutely a broader issue. I think that when it comes to campaigns around books, especially in publicity and marketing, it's obviously you need an editor who understands what you're saying, but when it comes to the craft of writing, a lot of that, it can be rooted in identity, but a lot of it can be learnt by editors everywhere. But the teams around the books being predominantly white in the industry is a real problem. You see it from the way, from the PR and marketing budgets books are allocated, from the way book covers are designed. Oh my God, like if I see one more fake Hindi print, like it's English words, and then come on, like I think that these things that publishing consider to be like so indicative of what, like, signaling what this book is about or what the book, who it's for, but those things have been made up by white people. They're not from us. So I think that's where the thing where having a diverse team is so important. And if you are working with a publisher, to the authors in the crowd who doesn't have that is a really hard thing. So finding that community elsewhere, like an agent that backs you, or people that can look at your cover and be like, no, you're not crazy, you can go back to them and say that this sucks. Like, I think that's also really important, and that's where spaces like this come in really useful, so you can find that. But yeah, it's a much bigger problem than just the editor. Problem is a challenge. It's a much bigger challenge than just the editor. And I think, obviously, I'm lucky to work in a company that is only made up of people of colour at the moment. But even that, I'm like, God forbid I get like a white straight author on my list. I don't know how that would happen, but like I don't know what to do. But it is interesting because from the perspective of having worked in much bigger houses, what those rooms look like, how you're talking about books and acquisitions, how the sales teams are putting numbers to them, all those like more granular things affect what happens when a book hits the shelves, and it affects how it can reach the readers that the author and the illustrator wanted to reach. And that is a much bigger task, I think, that the industry has not even started to unwrap what the internal workforce looks like and how that affects all of these authors' books. That wasn't a very positive answer. I think that change is happening very slowly. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I don't know. I actually think change was happening and it's kind of going back a little. I don't know, coming up. Actually, Eishar, you were the only one that I knew when I first started publishing the other South Asian children's person. And it's obviously gotten a lot better, but recently people of color have also been leaving publishing because they're overworked and underpaid so severely. Like a lot of people can't afford to live in London and do these jobs, which often, especially as an editor, like when you're reading submissions, it's day and night, it's weekdays and weekends. Like it's really consuming work that publishers know that you're doing for passion, and so can sometimes exploit. So I really hope people of color stay in publishing and it keeps getting better. But I think also to your point of like, it's not just about the editor, it's about the entire team. And I think I've seen a lot of like a person of color being brought in as like the editor, and the rest of the team stays white, and they're expected to do the work of the rest of the team, because the rest of the team can't be bothered to learn how to sell people of color and things like that. So I think it's everything needs to get better in the ecosystem. Not to be negative, I'm very hopeful. Yeah.
So I think we've done a good job of sort of scoping out the broader structural challenges, and as you're right, that can feel quite overwhelming. So let's try and focus on where writers, because there's a lot of writers in the room, where writers have some agency and think about sort of tips and advice. I guess firstly in terms of approaches to writing, and then secondly in terms of getting an agent if someone hasn't, things to think about. Are there sort of tips that you could pass on there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the tips that I give to writers from underrepresented backgrounds are always the same. It's always first start with the story that you want to write. Don't try and meet an expectation or fit into some sort of stereotype. Like, start with what you love writing, because that's going to carry you through the process. And then I always advocate for agents, because I think that agents will have your back. If you're working directly with a publisher, which sometimes you have to do, it can be tricky to advocate for yourself, and to have someone to have those difficult conversations for you is really important. But it is hard to find an agent. So if you do end up having any of those difficult conversations for yourself, I think the things to ask are, one, what is your vision for PR and marketing? Like, have something with you from the beginning when you sign with a publisher, so you can hold them to account, because they will promise you everything, and then who knows where that budget's going. So I think knowing to ask that, and then knowing also to interrogate like how much say you have in the process of like what your cover looks like, especially if you go to meet a team and you want to work with them, but the team is all white, and then you end up with maybe wondering how much can I push for. Like, knowing that you can ask for anything that you feel advocates for how you want your book to be and who you want it to reach is really important. And then also, I guess another thing that's quite useful is to find community elsewhere. So again, much like this space, in an industry that is really full of people that don't look like us, I think that finding support from other authors, like if you're a debut in your year, there's always like debut groups for authors that are coming out in that year. Or if you're, you want to know, like, you can always reach out to any of us. I'm sure everyone's happy to say that. If you want to know like what's okay to ask, there are places that you can go. I think that all the burden shouldn't be on the author, but sometimes it ends up being on the author. So if you are in that position, having support is really important, and that's where an agent can come in useful. Do you want to add?
Sure. I mean, that was perfect advice. That's definitely what I was going to say. I think community is really important throughout the process. Like, I think they'll be invaluable in feeding back like on each other's stories. It's really great to have that community and that kind of writing group and that safe space to share your story. I think they'll also be there for you when the book comes out. I think Chitra and Ian Eagleton, they do a great job of promoting other authors, and the other authors promote them. It's like a really lovely ecosystem. I think publishers, especially if you're working with smaller publishers, sometimes don't have the same budget for marketing, and it can really fall to the author. But I think having your community there will make it a lot easier to like shout about each other. I think there's so many things that you can do as an author to be part of community. It doesn't have to be, it can be in person like this. I've also seen some really great things on like Twitter. I've actually, one of my authors is here, Shayala Smith, and we met during a Twitter DB Pit like competition. And that's how I found her book. Like, it can happen anytime, anywhere. I've had authors pitch me at Story Space, which is an inclusive library at the Tate Museum. And we run some events, and they were there with their kids, and they had like great ideas. It can really happen anywhere, and I think it happens naturally when you build community. And, yeah.
I don't really feel that I've got much more to add to that, but I think community is really important, and I'd say Scooby is a really important community to be a part of. There are a huge number of people who are very supportive, very experienced, so definitely worth checking them out. And also, I would say if you are about to get published, take advantage of the library network. I think grassroots connections are incredibly important, and this is what libraries are really good at, particularly school libraries as well, because I think they have a ready-made audience, and yeah, connecting with that can be very useful.
Yes, so a lot of children's authors do events, and far more events than people who write for adults typically do. And sometimes that is publishers, planning a tour, and sometimes it's far more piecemeal, and perhaps authors, taking initiative themselves. Have you got advice for how to do that in such a way that you don't end up feeling like you never want to write another book, or that you've been exploited in doing those?
I mean, kids are so scary, man. Like, honestly, the children's authors will know, like, when you're in front of a group of kids, it's like, oh shit, like, I've really got to do this. So I think that, like, the main thing is to just be on their level. Like, that's really granular advice for events. But if you're doing events for kids, like, be on their level. Don't try and act like the teacher. I was just talking about this actually with Christine, who's over there, but like often teachers will be like, over to you, here you go. And I think that just having a hook or a thing that is maybe even only tangentially related to your book, but that you can lead in with, that's fun. Audience participation, all of those things. Those are more like practical tips for events. If you do find that you're carrying the burden of your PR and marketing, which does happen a lot, I would say that setting your own boundaries of what you want to do, like if you're ending up planning everything, then you're also entitled to be like, I want fees for XYZ, I want to charge for this, I'll do this many free events for schools in X community, but if I'm doing private schools or London schools or whatever, then I'll, like, thinking of those more practical things. If you have to do it all yourself and planning it all yourself, you're well within your rights to always set your own boundaries. Also with libraries, I would say that library events can be really fun, but they can also be really hectic. All the ones I've been to have been insane. So you can end up with really big crowds. So I'd always say to make sure that you like lean on the support that's there. So like librarians are absolutely brilliant. They always have like things up their sleeve. They always know the audience that's there. So if you are doing things in libraries, just lean on the librarians a lot. Right, Tate?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think part of the problem is that, particularly in public libraries, anyone can turn up. So whereas with a school, you can say you're talking to year 2, it could literally be anyone in a public library. I've organised a picture book event where the entire audience who came ended up being adults, which was a surprise to all of us. But I would also say try and make sure that books are available for sale. I think sometimes people treat authors as though they are children's entertainers. Yeah. That's not in anyone's interest. It's not going to benefit the children in the long term. And I think it's just taking advantage.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I think I would just add from like the picture book perspective, it's great to work with the illustrator if possible, and your publisher can help you do that. Like between the publisher and the illustrator, they can help create worksheets or like art activities, or the illustrator can come and do window art. Like there's so many things that you can do together to create that synergy between the story and the artwork, and to make sure that the kids are getting really engaged and it's interactive. So I think that if there's any way to do that, sometimes the illustrators like are in different countries, but I've seen illustrators like film themselves drawing something really easily, or that's where worksheets can come in, or some sort of just planned art activity can be really good, because once you've done telling the story, the kids want to find a way to keep engaging with it.
Yeah, so illustrators. So have you seen examples where writer and illustrator sort of go and do events together?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a brilliant one at Story Space, which was Faja and the Song of the River. And the author and illustrator both came over from France. And the author told the story and then held up examples of the musical instruments she was referencing in the book. The illustrator, meanwhile, was drawing the artwork on the window behind us. And then we had Kaneko Blocko come in and do a music kind of parade through the museum, and still have some art activities in the space that kids could do. So it was like, I think, the most interactive event we've ever had. But yeah, there are really great ways that you can come together.
Okay, we're going to have questions from the floor. So I'll just ask one final one, as we have 2 publishers here, which is how should people approach you if they've got an idea? Are you looking for full texts? Are you prepared for people to come up and say, I'm thinking of this? What do you favour, or what do you accept?
I mean, I'm happy for people to come up anytime and tell me about their ideas. I think I get that quite often. What it comes down to, I think, when they do actually submit, when they email, is to take it to acquisitions. We need like a synopsis, a sample of the writing. Like for picture book, it's usually like a rough draft because it's a shorter text. It could be a few pages even. For longer books, I know when I worked at Jacaranda, it was like a couple chapters. If it's an illustrator, we'll need 1 or 2 colored samples. And I think with that, we can usually take it to acquisitions because it's enough for the team to be able to get a vision of what it could be completely. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that we've done right from the beginning at Nights Of is to just have completely open submissions. So we're really contactable. The email address online. I'm also on social media. You can find me. And the reason we do that is because I do really want people to come with like questions like, could I write this, or would this work? And especially because there are so many people in underrepresented communities that don't know anything about publishing or know anything about writing. I'm sure everyone's spoken to someone that was like, oh, I kind of want to write a book, but how does that even work? So we're trying to really break down those barriers by being quite contactable. So you'll get a reply from someone if you email, or yeah, I'm always happy for authors to come and talk to me about their ideas or to send me things. I do accept submissions that aren't just via agents, which isn't common in the industry. But then I often, if I sign someone, I try and help them get an agent, so they have that person. So yeah, pretty easy to contact, pretty available. I would say that if you're sending something and you think it's ready to go out on submission, or you're doing it the more traditional way and you send it to me, and authors really can get bogged down in this idea of I have to have the perfect letter, or I have to have this amazing pitch, and there are so many workshops and things that gear authors towards that and teach them. And there are some useful skills in there, but my advice is always don't overthink it. Just send it. You don't have to write the perfect letter. If the book is good and if it reaches the right editor or agent, it will cut through. Yeah, so I think those are all my things. But yeah, very happy to be contacted. Oh, Wes, you're not happy to be contacted.
I am, but I'm probably not what she is.
I mean, the two of you, I think atypical in how approachable you are. So if anyone is thinking of they should take advantage today of.
Yeah.
Because typically publishers are like, this comes from an agent, or go on this desk, and maybe within 6 months you hear something. You know?
That's an awful process.
Yeah, I mean, not to say you'll get an answer straight away. We also focus, but yeah.
Okay. Audience. So any questions? I'm also fine with comments, which is always like a really dangerous thing to say. But we have said some things, and I'm aware that there's expertise throughout the room, so it's not a sort of it's a case of people here necessarily having the answers. But if we keep our contributions fairly brief, we'll get more of them in. Does anyone have a question or a comment? Okay, we've got one in the panel. Do we have a roving mic?
No.
This is
Okay. Because actually, the question is not.
Can I just wait, because I think we're being recorded, so we need to have mics. Thank you.
I'm actually going to wander over here because my question is actually, can we ask Sunny to contribute to the discussion about prizes and prize culture? As the founder of the Sherlock Prize and then subsequently the Sherlock Children's Prize, I was just, because of what you said, Darren, about being in a room and sometimes being the only person in the room, I was just really interested in what her perspective might be, if she wouldn't mind giving us that about.
Great, yeah. So you pass the mic to Sunny. Thank you, Geeta.
Might not get picked up in the podcast.
I was sitting in the back, listening to you guys and learning from you. Okay, so yes, I do run the Sherlock Prize. We now have 3 awards going forward. And in 2020, we started the Sherlock Children's and Young Adult Prize. I'm going to pick up on a couple of things you guys said. So yes, things have changed. Our first year, which was when we opened submissions in 2016. That first year we had 15 books that went from picture books all the way up to young adults. Last year we were in 3 figures over, so yes, that has shifted. It's not enough because it's still a very, very tiny amount of books that are being published out there. They also don't have the marketing budgets behind them, so that's an issue. Something else that I think both Eishar and Cherish raised is the problem of not having marketing teams and sales teams who understand how to sell. And it also links back to what Carminda said earlier, where I still find people telling me, I still find there are lots of bookshops that I don't feel comfortable going into. And I think that applies to a lot of kids. who are going to be, within a few years, your main book buying audience, customer. I always go back to something that was in the CLPE report, I think 2019. 1 out of every 3 children in a school in Wales and England is a child of an ethnic minority background. That's your customer, that's a third of your market. And unfortunately, we're not reaching that far. We're not getting through to the bookshops, and that is that long tail of publishing, where I think there's a fair amount of understanding that amongst editors that they need to do better as a whole. I don't think that necessarily works its way down the chain. Having said that, I have been like Darren, that person, the only person of color in the room, and having to not just pull out books, but also often to advocate and really fight for books. Because even now in 2024, it's perfectly acceptable for various prizes, who I shall not name, to have completely white shortlists and long lists. And it comes back down to, first it comes down to, oh, it's bad literary merit. Then it comes down to, well, it's interesting, but it isn't really relatable. And that tends to be the point where it ends, because there's going to be often lots of juries that will say that. That's why I like Donald Price. Everything's relatable.
Thank you so much. I also want to quickly shout out the Little Rebels Award, because there are a couple of winners here. And it looks at sort of rebellious children's fiction, but it has done a really good job at promoting, I think, inclusive fiction, if you want to call it that. Zainab Min over there was self-published and very prolifically self-published, but I think I'm okay to say the Little Rebels Award really helped in terms of getting an agent and publishing deal and all that sort of thing.
Huge weight, yeah.
Other questions or comments?
Thank you, that's it.
So there's 1, 2.
So firstly, thank you for that panel, because that's really illuminating, and also thank you for weighing in, Sunny. I've got one question. One was, actually no, first I'm going to say about bookshops, so I reckon I'm probably the only bookshop person in the room, which is, that is also why the indies are able to do something that, and I loved that you reached out to all the indies for Janet Prize, because what we do is we're going into schools and we're making friends with the kids, not even with our event hats on, not even publicizing author events, but we're going in and talking to them about books, so that they have a friend in their school with whom they then know, oh, they've got a bookshop. I can carry on this conversation, or I can see them again down the high street. And Perlinda was also talking about Seven Oaks Bookshop, which is Blood as a brilliant thing like that. And that is why I really loved that you reached out, because we could continue doing that, and that's what good indies will do. But I do have a question for the panel and also other people in the room, which is a little bit about self-publishing. We see a lot of people who want to write and people who want to illustrate, and their first port of call will often be to self-publish, because the world of publishing seems so closed up to them, and we struggle as a bookshop to be able to support them when they are self-published. So I was wondering if anyone has any comments and thoughts on whether there is a right path, whether there's a wrong path, whether there's a way they can come in between, and generally what's your advice?
So before I go to the panel, I'm going to ask Zainab, if it's not putting you on the spot, whether you want to say a bit about self-publishing, because you're very experienced in self-publishing and being published. Oh,
Okay.
the mic's there.
Yeah.
Zainab,
Thank you
yeah.
so much. Thank you. Since you said it, I like my answer.
Yeah, well,
Hi everyone. Yes, so I started off self-publishing the book, which is now known as the Panettone series. And of course, the huge challenge with self-publishing is you can make the book as great as it can be, but it's not going to be on the shelves, because you're competing against all these massive publishers who have all these sales teams and are getting reviews in the magazines and newspapers. And there's only so far you can go with self-publishing, because you'll just be ignored and told that it's not good enough to be on the shelf just because it's self-published. That's what I found. So the struggle, writing it is you get up to one point, but then the struggle is marketing it, which is very hard to do as an individual.
And did you have outlets for marketing your self-published books?
No, just little old me. And that's where the Little Rebels all came in and sort of brought it into the spotlight and hugely helped.
Other thoughts on self-publishing?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true, is that you can do everything you can, and then you do hit this point, like you both said, that you can't get your book onto shelves like as easily. I think that self-publishing, like traditional publishing, feels really threatened by self-publishing, I think, because it's like, oh my God, this is our jobs. What if the authors can do it all by themselves? Which obviously isn't how the whole operation works, but it's actually really useful if you are knocking on all those doors and you're not getting answers to explore self-publishing, if only to prove, well, you don't really have to prove yourself, but it does prove to publishing that you have an audience, especially if your book does well and you know there's an audience for it. And then you can take that route of then becoming traditionally published. So you're almost taking this two-tier approach of, I'm putting the book out there because I can't get it out with a traditional publisher. I'm showing that the audience exists, and then that book often gets picked up by a publisher, and then you see it in shelves. So that's mostly how self-published books end up in publishing. I think that from my perspective, I can't offer too much on the process of self-publishing, but it's good to know there are people here who know more about it. And also, don't be scared of it.
Yeah, I think I would just add that, like, I don't find that publishers are scared of it. I find that they're looking to not like exploit, but they look at it as a content avenue. There are a lot of self-published books that then make it into traditional publishing. There's a lot of fan fiction. I think 50 Shades of Grey was fan fiction, Twilight fan fiction. Like, there's a lot of things like that. There's a lot of like even graphic novels that came from webtoons or like being published on these platforms and then moved into physical books. So yeah, like Eishar said, don't be scared of it, but also know what you're getting into, because it is like you, one person, acting as an entire publishing team for yourself. Like, you're writing it, you're editing it, you're learning how to put it on certain self-published platforms, you're learning how to market it, you're going into bookstores, like you're a one-person team. And it's all the more admirable when you do it.
I think David has a question.
Yeah.
The mic is coming. The mic is coming for you.
I'm David Solaria. I think I got a fairly obvious question. I've spent my kind of whole life really working in publishing, and it's not really fashionable now, but I liked making books for boys. Now, what I'm wanting to ask is, do South Asian men not want to work in publishing, and where are they?
Darren, you want to take this?
Well, it's always difficult to address a question about absence because people equipped to answer it aren't here. And I don't feel in any way equipped to speak on behalf of South Asian men. I think children's publishing in general, my impression is largely is dominated by women as writers and perhaps as editors as well. I think most of the time when I have contact, it's women, it's white women who are in those jobs. And I think you'd have to unpack that. Part of that is class, part of that is who is often English lit graduates, and the demographic, the stats on that. Jeffrey Boache was speaking the other day and talked about how some, so-called immigrant families, that if you're going to go to university, make sure you do a degree that's going to generate some money. That's a feeling that's sometimes out there. So there's less in the arts and humanities, or certainly seen as ways to earn money. And if you're in writing, generally, you've got to have another source of income. You've either got to have someone else in your house who's bringing in money, or that you are doing other jobs. So I think all those things contribute. But I don't think that answers fully your question. But as I say, I'm not necessarily equipped to do so either.
Could I add?
Yeah, sure.
So I think that there's also an element there of what books kids are reading when they grow up to want to even work with books. And traditionally, like South Asian boys in books have not been well represented. So I think there's a bit of work for publishing to do Like I have recently worked with Nikesh Shukla on Council of Good Friends, which is about like 4 kids who are having an adventure, and it's young fiction. And then it's very much the case that hopefully kids will read that, and then in 15, 20 years that they will grow into boys and young men who want to work with books and are able to access hopefully a slightly improved industry. But yeah, I think you're right. There are a lot of intersections that lead into that, but also what are you reading at a young age that's going to make you care about books? Do you see yourself? Are you attached to it? Like, it's not. Do you want to add?
Well, no, I was just saying that when I was growing up, I was the only one in my whole class.
Yeah.
I wasn't reading books that represented finding anybody me, but I still wanted to work in publishing. And I worked in a bakery. When I worked in a bakery on the night shift, so I could go out with my portfolio during the day. And that is the thing. But when I started, all the men, I started at Reader's Digest, it was all male editors. I worked for Giulio Marzocco in Florence. There was only one female in the whole of the building working there. Something has to happen to attract this, to have different voices coming in. You can, it's if you have picture books and novels, the research from 3 years ago shows that children like information books, and they are just completely negated by, well, a lot of publishers and bookshops. It's very difficult.
Thank you, David. We just have to leave it there because we're out of time. You want to ask a very quick one?
Question, question going back to the readability as well as the commercial. Is there a view in the industry that South Asian books are for the South Asian audience? I grew up in India in the 80s on Enid Blyton and Shakespeare, and everything, and it was all relatable to me. So why is there the pushback that the South Asian stories will not be relatable to anyone else who's not a South Asian?
Shall I pick that up? Because I'll be very quick. I think it's the question isn't if South Asian books are relatable or not. It's the fact that the majority believes that their books are relatable for everybody, including minorities, but not the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, I think also that there's just a point to be made about all kids should read all perspectives because it builds empathy. And I think that publishing as an industry really needs to remember that, which is exactly what Sunny's trying to do.
Yeah, I would add that I think, as we talked about before, our sales and marketing and publicity and stuff is not generally as inclusive. And I think part of that plays in because they do see it as, okay, well, we're going to market to this 0.3%, and that's not commercial and blah, blah. When really these books are for everyone. We've been reading white people our whole lives.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And it's something that, I feel like we're constantly having to push back on ourselves, like when we're in those rooms. I do think it is important when we are publishing these stories to make sure that our communities have access to them, which is why I love initiatives like the Free Books campaign and things like that, because I do think that perspective is also important, making sure that these books should be marketed to everyone, but also making sure that our communities have access to them and also know about them.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, you just join me in thanking our panelists.